recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my bipartisan amendment to address the deeply flawed North Shore helicopter route, which is impacting communities throughout Long Island, especially my constituents on the North Fork. The FAA's North Shore helicopter route, which was made mandatory through an FAA bureaucratic edict in 2010, represents everything that's wrong with our unaccountable federal bureaucracy. It lacks fairness, transparency, and common sense. It's not a bright idea to mandate aircraft traffic bound for the tip of an island to make its transition over land when multiple all-water routes which mitigate the noise impact are available. In addition to being ill-conceived and misguided, what makes this FAA mandate so extremely unfair is that it shifts the majority of air traffic in the area over Long Island's North Fork, which does not have a busy airport or helicopter pad, and thus doesn't get any of the economic benefit that the air traffic brings to neighboring communities on the South Fork that have an active seasonal airport. To close these loopholes and address this unfairness, I offer this critical amendment that will force the FAA to reassess the North Shore route and work on replacing it with a true all-water route over the Atlantic Ocean. This amendment also requires the FAA to hold public hearings on the North Shore route in the communities impacted by this flawed route, and open up a public comment period so that people who live with aircraft noise season after season can have a voice. The FAA has for years ignored my constituents and the law since long before I was even in Congress. By continuing to extend the North Shore route through emergency authority, the FAA has been waiving the requirements in the Administrative Procedure Act and other federal laws and regulations that require public comment and the consultation of the impacted local governments before any major regulatory decisions are made. I represent a district that's almost completely surrounded by water, so it is common sense that aircraft departing New York City bound for airports on the east end of Long Island can reduce noise by following true all-water routes. My amendment also requires the FAA to enforce its own rules regarding altitude restrictions for the aircraft following this flawed route. This is not just an issue in my district, but also impacts residents who are impacted by noise in Nassau County and Queens. That is why I've partnered with my Democratic colleagues, Representatives Grace Meng and Tom Suozzi, on this amendment. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
First, does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. This amendment directs the FAA administrator to offer a public comment period and public hearing with respect to the New York North Shore helicopter route. Would then be required to review the applicable regulations related to the route and assess the noise impacts on communities and the availability of alternative or supplemental routes to reduce those impacts. So I oppose it on the grounds it's really not good policy to legislate on noise in a piecemeal fashion, addressing each region and each airport one by one. That's not the best way to address air traffic noise. The committee has been aware of this issue for some time, and certainly of the occasionally unreasonable exposure to helicopter noise reported by residents in urban areas. The Aviation Subcommittee held a roundtable on this in October 2011 to explore this issue, and perhaps it is time to re-up that roundtable to get some movement on this issue. But further, I have concern about possible unintended consequences of legislative proposals that could lead to the redistribution of aircraft noise. Although well-intentioned, such proposals have social justice ramifications and often can end up distributing noise over socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. We have to make sure that noise is distributed equitably if we're going to make these decisions. So I'd be happy to work, and I think on our side we'd be happy to work with the gentleman and the co-sponsors to try to address these concerns by talking directly with the FAA, but I have to oppose taking the solution towards a legislative resolution. So with that, I'd ask colleagues to oppose it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from New York.
First off, with respect to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, it is very important for my constituents to have a voice. And what's important to note here is that this route was extended by the FAA, putting the Federal Register in the middle of a weekend. No one told myself. No one told any of the local governments. There was no public hearing. There were no public comments accepted. Actually, the FAA in this case went out of their way to ensure that my constituents had zero voice whatsoever. That's under the current federal law. I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to the chairman of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank the gentleman and rise in support of his amendment. Again, this amendment does address the concerns of the people on Long Island. As the gentleman pointed out, this was put in place without public comment, without talking to the folks that live and have to live under these overflights. So I applaud him for his efforts and commitment to his constituents on this issue. He has worked tirelessly for the last 2 Congresses on this issue and been a tremendously effective advocate. So I thank the gentleman for his continued leadership and I thank him for his amendment and encourage members to support Mr. Zeldin's amendment and yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Well, I thank the chairman for his support of this amendment, for doing everything in his power to ensure that my constituents have a voice, that they are heard, that they are represented, that they are able to provide their public comments, that they are allowed to have a hearing with the FAA. Really is very much appreciated by the residents of my district. And to my colleagues, Congresswoman Grace Meng, Congressman Swazi, for everyone on the other side of the aisle who is showing leadership in supporting this effort, it is much appreciated, understanding that this was literally jammed through in the Federal Register without all sorts of, not just courtesies provided, but worse, actually muzzling the voice of people that they couldn't even share any of their comments whatsoever. Summer after summer, the quality of life of East End residents has suffered due to the persistent issue of this noise. The FAA and Department of Transportation have sole jurisdiction over the aircraft routes that have impacted these communities, but from the route's planning to its continued use, they have flat out ignored the residents directly affected. I'm urging all my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back.